Some insults sting. Others leave bruises on the soul. But when it comes from your own blood, in front of a room full of strangers, it doesn't just hurt, it changes you. For 32 years, Helen devoted herself to her family. A quiet, resilient woman. The kind who raised 3 children on her own without complaint. The kind who kept everyone else's secrets while burying her own pain deep, where no one could reach it. So when her granddaughter Jasmine stood at the center of her baby shower, glowing and surrounded by love, and laughed as she called Helen a washed-up grandma, Helen didn't say a word. She just smiled. But that smile was not forgiveness. It was something else. Because Helen had kept a secret. One that had been sealed for over 3 decades. A truth that could shatter the family image Jasmine was so proud to flaunt. And the man Jasmine thought was the father of her child? He wasn't even the beginning of the story. Family portraits often capture what we want to remember, not what actually happened. A well-lit frame. Everyone smiling. Shoulders touching. But there's always someone outside the frame. Someone left out. Someone erased. And every once in a while, that someone remembers everything. Helen had been that person her whole life. Always behind the camera. Always cleaning up after other people's messes. Quietly dependable. Casually dismissed. She didn't seek attention. She never asked for thanks. But there's a cost to being the family's foundation when no one ever looks down to see what's holding them up. Her children grew up and drifted. Her grandchildren saw her as furniture. Present, sturdy but silent. They never asked how she got her scars. They never questioned why she sat in the back row of every family gathering. That baby shower, though, that moment was different. It wasn't just an offhand comment. It was years of disregard spoken aloud, wrapped in a laugh and validated by clapping hands. What Jasmine didn't know was that the foundation she stood on was built on choices Helen made before Jasmine was even born. Before there was a baby to celebrate. Before there was a daughter to raise. Before there was even a family name to pass down. There was a lie. And Helen had protected that lie longer than she had protected herself. There had been nights she couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt, but because of the weight of silence. The kind of silence that comes from knowing something that could change lives, but choosing to carry it alone. That weight had kept her up for years. And now, as Jasmine unwrapped her gifts and soaked in admiration, Helen knew the silence had gone on long enough. There was a time long ago when Helen stood in Jasmine's shoes. Young, hopeful, full of dreams. Back when she still believed people were who they said they were. Back before loyalty became currency and love had conditions. She had once been the one glowing at her own baby shower, wearing a hand-sewn maternity dress, clutching a second-hand teddy bear from a man she thought would always stay. That man left. And in his place came the lies. Lies Helen never asked for. Lies she didn't create, but ones she was forced to hold, to preserve the illusion that family meant harmony. She did it for Teresa, her daughter. She did it because back then truth was more dangerous than silence. But silence has an expiration date. And Helen had reached hers. What Jasmine never saw, what she could never have imagined, was that her baby shower wasn't a celebration for Helen. It was a reckoning. In her quiet way, Helen had come prepared. Not with gifts wrapped in ribbons, but with something older. Something heavier. A truth that had waited patiently for 32 years. In the back seat of her car sat an envelope, yellowed with time, sealed twice. And in the front passenger seat was a man no one in that room had seen in decades. Jasmine wouldn't recognize him. Teresa would, and once he stepped through the door, the room would never feel the same again. Because some stories don't begin at birth. They begin the moment someone decides not to tell the truth. And Helen? She was done waiting. This was her chapter now. And it was never going to be written in silence again. To understand what Helen did, you have to understand what she lived through. Helen was never dramatic. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She just endured. A life of service. Of motherhood. Of betrayal. From the outside, she looked like any other woman who had quietly aged into the background of her family's photos. A gentle presence in every Christmas picture. A silent helper at every birthday. She was the one refilling the drinks, holding the baby, washing the dishes before anyone asked. But no one asked about her. At 65, Helen had learned that being dependable often meant being invisible. And being invisible meant people assumed you didn't feel, that you didn't remember, that you didn't hurt. But Helen remembered everything. She remembered being 18 and terrified, alone in a small clinic, holding her belly, praying for a healthy baby. She remembered the moment her husband walked out, leaving behind nothing but silence and debt. She remembered picking up an extra job cleaning offices at night, just so her daughters could eat something more than rice and beans. And she remembered Teresa, her firstborn, growing up with a kind of distance that felt colder than strangers. Teresa was always angry. Even as a child, she looked at Helen with eyes full of something sharp. A daughter who blamed her mother for everything that was missing, everything that wasn't said, every birthday that felt quieter than it should have been. Helen tried to bridge the gap. She tried birthdays and letters and stories and songs, but nothing held. Teresa grew into a woman who mistook silence for weakness. And when she became a mother herself, she did something Helen had never done. She used her child as a wall. Jasmine was born on a rainy Wednesday. Helen had stood outside the hospital room, waiting 3 hours before Teresa let her in. The nurse placed the baby into Helen's arms. For a brief moment, time slowed. Jasmine looked up, eyes wide, hands clenched. She had Teresa's brow, but Helen's mouth. Helen whispered, "Welcome." And for the first time in a long while, she felt the flicker of belonging again. But that feeling didn't last. Teresa had no intention of letting Helen raise Jasmine the way Helen had raised her. The visits were limited. The conversations short. The gratitude, non-existent. As Jasmine grew, she picked up her mother's tone. The same sharpness. The same disregard. At 10, she told Helen not to pick her up from school. "You're too slow." At 14, she rolled her eyes when Helen offered advice. At 19, she stopped visiting altogether. Still, Helen gave gifts, left voicemails, folded baby clothes long before anyone announced a pregnancy. Because hope is a strange thing. It lingers even when logic says it shouldn't. Jasmine, now 25, was bold, bright, beautiful, an influencer, some said. Always online, always polished, always performing. But Helen saw something behind her eyes, a hunger for approval, a need to be adored. Jasmine had been raised in a world that rewarded the loudest voice, the shiniest truth. She crafted an image of family that looked perfect on Instagram. But none of it was rooted in real history. None of it acknowledged where she came from, or who made it possible for her to stand where she stood. And yet, even as she ignored Helen's calls, even as she rolled her eyes during holidays, she still expected her grandmother to be present. Like wallpaper. Seen, but not acknowledged. Then came the baby shower. A garden affair. Everything color coordinated. Lavender and gold. Rows of curated smiles. A photographer capturing moments that would later be filtered and captioned with #grateful. Jasmine made a toast. She thanked her friends, her followers, her mother. Then, with a smirk that drew laughter from the crowd, she gestured toward Helen and said, "Even Grandma's here, though she's more of a washed-up one now." The laughter echoed. Helen didn't flinch. But inside something moved. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something older. A door creaking open. A memory stepping forward. Because what Jasmine didn't realize was that the person she was mocking, the woman in the corner of the party with weathered hands and quiet eyes, was the only one who knew the full story. The only one who had all the pieces. And Helen had held those pieces in silence for decades. For Teresa's sake. For Jasmine's. For a version of peace that had never been returned to her. But there's a difference between keeping a secret to protect someone, and keeping it because no one bothered to ask. Helen wasn't looking for revenge. But there are truths that ache when buried too long. And some names can only be spoken once the audience is ready to listen. Jasmine's baby would be born into a family built on a lie. Helen had lived through it once. She wouldn't allow it to happen again. Not without revealing the truth behind the name on Jasmine's birth certificate. And not without finally looking Teresa in the eye and asking her one question. When did I stop being your mother? It was never just about a baby shower. It was about years. Years of subtle dismissals. Of sidelong glances. Of laughter that excluded her. It was about setting the table while others sat down to eat. About taking family photos she was never asked to be in. About birthday cards never opened. Jasmine's comment had been a spark, but the fire had been building for decades. To truly understand Helen's silence and her breaking point, you have to go back to 1980, when Teresa was 7. Her father, Marvin, had walked out that spring. No warning, no letter, no goodbye, just a jacket missing from the hook, and the quiet thud of the front door that never opened again. Helen had begged him to stay, not for her but for Teresa. But Marvin had looked her in the eyes and said words she never repeated to anyone. "She's not mine." For years, Helen lived under the weight of that one sentence. Marvin never came back, and Helen never corrected the story. Teresa grew up thinking her father had abandoned her, that he chose to leave, and she blamed Helen for it. That blame settled into her bones. It shaped her teenage years into rebellion. Every argument was a war, every silence a punishment. She would come home late, disappear for days, refuse to explain. And through it all, Helen never raised a hand. She only asked one thing: please don't become a stranger. But the truth was Teresa already had. By the time she was 22, she was pregnant, unmarried, distant. She moved out soon after Jasmine was born, refusing Helen's help beyond what was necessary. Over time, the pattern repeated. Jasmine learned by watching. She saw how her mother spoke to Helen and copied the tone. She saw how her mother rolled her eyes and mirrored the disrespect. Children don't inherit hate. They're taught it, in whispers, in silences, in the way love is withheld. Jasmine grew up confident but cold. Every Christmas, she smiled for the camera but walked past Helen like furniture. Every family dinner, she laughed loudest at the jokes made at Helen's expense. And Helen, she let it happen. Because sometimes, silence feels like the only way to keep what little peace is left. But it wasn't peace. It was fear. Fear that telling the truth would make her lose them forever. And so she gave gifts, advice, even money when Teresa was behind on rent. And in return she got cold calls, brief nods, and questions like, "Why are you still living in that old house?" Then 2 weeks after the baby shower, Helen was sorting through an old drawer in her bedroom, one she hadn't opened in years. Beneath some folded towels and yellowing papers, she found it. A photo. Faded but intact. Teresa, maybe 19, standing next to a man no one in the family had ever seen. His hand rested gently on her back. They looked close, intimate, comfortable. Helen held the photo for a long time. Not because she forgot the man, but because she remembered him too clearly. His name was Raymond Fields. A quiet, kind man Helen had met once. Teresa had never told anyone about him. But Helen remembered the nights her daughter came home late during that year. The secret of smiles. The occasional softness in her voice. And now, decades later, a memory uncoiled itself. A Sunday morning. Teresa, barely 20, pacing in the kitchen. Nervous. She had said, "I'm late." Helen had asked, "Have you told him?" Teresa shook her head. "He's got a real girlfriend. A whole life. He's not going to claim this." That's when it clicked. Jasmine was never Marvin's granddaughter. She was Raymond's. Helen had buried that detail out of respect. She thought maybe it was none of her business. But Jasmine was now a grown woman, about to become a mother herself. And she was living a version of life built entirely on curated lies. How could a child learn to love truthfully when her very name was built on a foundation of silence? That's when Helen made the decision. Not out of vengeance, but because someone had to stop the pattern. Because the insult at the baby shower wasn't just rude. It wasn't even what broke her. It was the applause. The sound of approval from the people she had sacrificed everything for. And it wasn't just about Jasmine. It was about every room Helen had entered and been ignored in. Every conversation paused when she walked in. Every story rewritten in her absence. It was about being erased from her own family's narrative. And now she held a key. A photo. A memory. A name. The man Jasmine thought was her father wasn't. The family Jasmine believed in was a collage of half-truths. And the only person with the full story was the one they kept on the edge of every celebration. But not this time. Helen picked up her old address book, flipped through the yellowed pages, stopped at a number scribbled faintly in pencil. Raymond Fields. Her hand trembled as she dialed. The phone rang. Once. twice. Then a voice, older but unmistakable. "Hello." Helen took a breath. "It's Helen," she said quietly. "There's something I think you need to know. And someone I think your granddaughter should meet." Secrets are strange things. They start out small, easy to fold and tuck away. But over time they grow teeth. And if you keep them long enough, they learn to whisper. Helen had kept one such secret for 32 years. A secret so entangled with pain and pride that even she had tried to forget it. It had started with a phone call. A neighbor had seen her husband's car parked outside a small house on Ash Grove Lane, 3 nights in a row. Helen hadn't believed it. She trusted David, her husband, her first and only love. But that night, the coffee pot had burned dry. The rain wouldn't stop falling. And something inside her, something old and tired, told her to go see for herself. She took the car, didn't even bring an umbrella. The house was dimly lit. The door was slightly ajar. And what she saw when she stepped inside stayed with her forever. David wasn't alone. He was holding a crying girl, barely 19. That girl's name was Lorraine, Teresa's best friend since childhood. A girl who used to call Helen Mom when she stayed for dinner. A girl Helen had once tucked into bed during sleepovers. And now she was pregnant. David turned around when he saw Helen. He didn't even try to explain. He just stood there, soaked in guilt, holding Lorraine's shaking hands. Helen didn't scream. She didn't cry. She turned around, got back into the car, and drove home in silence. That was the night Helen's marriage ended. But she never filed for divorce. She didn't want Teresa, who was only 15 at the time, to know. Didn't want to break the image of a father her daughter still worshipped. So she told everyone David had passed in an accident 6 months later. She staged the lie so carefully that even the neighbors stopped asking questions. Teresa never suspected. Helen erased David from every frame of their lives and carried on like a widow. But Lorraine disappeared from town. Rumors flew of a baby, of a family up north that took her in. Helen knew better than to chase ghosts. Until recently. Until Jasmine's baby shower, and the photo she found, and the voice on the phone that had said, "This is Raymond." But Raymond wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. Helen had gone further. 1 week after calling Raymond, she went online. She searched for Lorraine. A few dead ends. A few wrong turns. Then an obituary. Lorraine Fields. Passed away 4 years ago. Survived by a son. The same man Jasmine had been dating for 2 years. The man she thought was the father of her unborn child. But he wasn't. Because when Helen looked closer, something jumped out. Lorraine had a son, named Christopher. And David, Helen's husband, had fathered that child. Which meant Christopher was Jasmine's half-uncle. And Jasmine's baby? The result of a relationship no one in the family could have ever predicted. And yet no one had known. Not Teresa. Not Jasmine. Not even Christopher himself. But Helen knew. And in that moment, the story unraveled backwards and forwards all at once. Jasmine wasn't just mocking her grandmother at a baby shower. She was blindly walking into the same trap that had ruined the women before her. Betrayal, silence, and family secrets repeated across generations. Helen had protected them from this truth all her life. But now she saw the cost. Generational pain. A mother who hated her for lies she didn't tell. A granddaughter who had no idea who she really was. And a child about to be born into a lineage of secrets. So Helen made a final call. She didn't warn Teresa. She didn't prepare Jasmine. She simply called Christopher. Invited him for tea. He came. Sat on her porch, smiled politely, and asked how she was. Helen looked him in the eye. "There's something you need to know," she said. "And you deserve to hear it before your child is born." That was the beginning of the storm. Not the end. The air inside the rented event hall was thick with celebration. Balloons and soft pastels floated lazily across the ceiling. The buffet tables were heavy with finger foods and mocktails. Laughter came in waves. Jasmine was glowing in her blush-pink maternity dress. She held court at the center, surrounded by friends, Instagram smiles, and curated memories. And then the door opened. Late. Unannounced. And everything stopped. Helen stepped in, dressed not in bright florals or grandmotherly lace but in black. A full-length dress. Modest. regal. Her hair pulled neatly into a bun. Her hands folded around a single envelope. And behind her walked a man few recognized. Tall, silver-haired. His frame softened with age but held together by quiet dignity. His name was David. Her husband. Jasmine blinked, confused. Teresa stood frozen. Her champagne glass trembled slightly in her hand. No one spoke. Not until Helen did. She walked forward, slow, deliberate, as though time itself had to pause with every step. She turned to Jasmine, whose smile had vanished, replaced with a nervous tilt of the head. Helen didn't look at Teresa. Didn't look at the guests. Her eyes were fixed only on her granddaughter. And then she said it. Before you raise your child on lies, meet the man who made you possible. The silence shattered. Someone dropped a plate. A baby started crying in the back of the room. Jasmine furrowed her brows. What are you talking about? But Teresa knew. She stepped forward, her voice tight. Helen, stop this. Right now. But Helen remained still. Calm. She opened the envelope and placed a photo on the gift table. A young Lorraine. Smiling. Pregnant. Beside her, David. Helen spoke again, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Your best friend, Teresa. Lorraine. She didn't run away. She had his child. Your father's child. His name is Christopher. The same Christopher your daughter is having a child with. Jasmine stepped back, her face drained of color. No, she said. That's not. She turned to her mother. Tell me this isn't true. Teresa said nothing. Her eyes locked on the man she thought had died 3 decades ago. He's alive, she whispered. You lied. The room tilted sideways. Emotion rippled across the space in slow waves. Confusion, horror, disbelief. And through it all, Helen stood still. I buried the truth to protect you, she said quietly. But I see now lies don't protect. They infect. David stepped forward, his voice gruff with age. I came today not to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed to tell the truth before it's too late. I have another son. He's your brother, Teresa. And Jasmine, he's your uncle. Jasmine's legs gave out beneath her. Someone caught her. Her makeup smeared as tears followed gravity. She looked at Helen again. Why would you do this now? Helen's gaze softened. Because you mocked the wrong woman. You stood in a room full of people, looked me in the eyes and called me a washed-up grandma. But I was never washed up. I was washed over. By your mother's bitterness. By your pride. By secrets I carried alone. And I have stayed silent for so long that you forgot I was still standing. Teresa finally spoke, her voice sharp and trembling. You destroyed my baby shower. You humiliated us in front of everyone. Helen turned to her daughter, her voice colder now. No. You did that. The day you decided to erase me. To pretend I was a burden. To let your daughter believe I was nothing. You set this fire. I simply held up a mirror. The guests were leaving now. One by one, awkwardly, murmuring their goodbyes. The celebration had turned into something else, something unspoken. Jasmine was still seated, holding her belly, her tears drying against her skin. Christopher hadn't come. Helen had told him not to. This part, she had said, isn't yours to clean up. Teresa tried to storm past her mother, but Helen caught her arm. Not to hurt. Just to remind. You thought silence was weakness. You were wrong. It was survival, and with that, Helen walked out. David followed behind, older now, defeated in posture, but free in a way he hadn't been since Lorraine first disappeared. The envelope still sat on the table. Inside it, a photo of Helen holding Teresa as a baby. A letter Helen had written to herself the night David left. A DNA test. 3 generations of truth. Sitting next to unopened baby shower gifts and forgotten balloons. For decades, Helen had been everyone's shadow. That day she became the storm. Not loud. Not violent. Just undeniable. And when she closed the door behind her, she didn't look back. Because finally, they were the ones who had to sit with the silence. The storm passed. But not without damage. Teresa didn't call. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not even when Jasmine gave birth 3 months later. For Teresa, the baby shower became the moment she said her final goodbye to her mother. She didn't yell, she didn't cry. She simply vanished from Helen's life like a door quietly clicking shut. But she did one thing before she disappeared. She confirmed it. A phone call. A private visit to Lorraine's sister. A truth she'd buried so deep that even she had started to believe her own lies. Helen had not made it up. David was alive. Lorraine was pregnant. Christopher was her half-brother. And Jasmine had fallen in love with him, unaware of the blood that bound them. Teresa hung up the phone that day and didn't speak a word to anyone. She packed up a small box of photos from her childhood, placed it in the attic, and locked the door behind it. Jasmine, though, she unraveled slowly. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Amara, Grace. And then she did something unexpected. She started therapy. Because she didn't know whether to thank Helen or hate her. She couldn't decide if her grandmother had saved her life or destroyed it. If the secret had freed her, or broken her in a way she would never quite repair. She asked herself that question every time she looked at her daughter. Will I raise her in truth, or an image? Helen never asked for forgiveness. She didn't write a letter, didn't reach out again. She simply left, packed 2 suitcases, a box of books, and moved to a small coastal town where no one knew her name. She rented a cottage with white curtains and a garden that needed taming. And for the first time in her life she started writing. In spiral notebooks. With soft pens. Page after page. The story of her life. Not for anyone else. Just for herself. The silence in that house was different. It wasn't heavy. Didn't ache. It was hers. And sometimes she would sit by the window, sip her tea, and listen to the ocean. Not waiting. Not regretting. Just remembering. Back home the story became legend. Whispers passed through family circles. You remember what happened at Jasmine's baby shower? Do you know Helen showed up with the father? I heard the girl didn't even know who her dad was until that day. Poor thing. But maybe lucky too. Some said Helen went too far. Others said she waited too long. But nobody could deny one thing. She was never just a grandmother. She was the vault. The witness. The keeper of a truth no one else had the courage to speak. And when she finally did, she didn't scream. She whispered it into the middle of a celebration. And walked away. Helen didn't want revenge. She wanted peace. And sometimes the only way to reclaim your dignity is to stop protecting the very people who used it against you. Not all stories are loud. Some echo quietly in the hearts of those who lived them. Helen's story is not just about betrayal. Not just about secrets or revenge. It's about silence. The silence women carry when they've been pushed aside, mocked or forgotten. The silence of mothers who raise daughters who never truly see them. The silence of grandmothers whose names are barely remembered, until they break that silence in a way no one expects. Have you ever kept a secret to protect someone, only to realize it cost you more than silence ever should? Have you ever watched your truth become someone else's lie? Because it was easier that way? What would you have done if you were in Helen's shoes? Would you have shown up that day? Would you have said those words? Or would you have let the lie live, to keep the peace that never included you? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video if it made you feel something. If it reminded you of someone you love, or someone you've lost. These are the stories we don't read in books. The ones passed in whispers. The chapters we never hear. But the ones that change us the most. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the quietest women carry the loudest truths.